Before Ginny Evans introduces our esteemed guest speaker, Chris Paliare, I wanted just to remind everybody that our society is involved in the preservation and promotion of our Macedonian history and heritage, dealing both with the old country and here in Canada. The Historical Society has been an important voice in the diaspora for over 30 years. And we've been active, as you know, even in this pandemic, with several large events over the past year. And we continue to be curators of books, artifacts, interviews of people in our community, curators, costumes, and art. But tonight, we're proud to have homegrown talent. And I want to turn things over to Ginny Evans to introduce our guest speakers. Thank you, Ginny.
Well, Chris himself describes himself as a trial lawyer and a Macedonian with passion and commitment for violations of human rights of our fellow Macedonians, whether in Canada or internationally. This quote about himself may be good enough to describe his personal human rights cause. However, his worth as a lawyer has seen him honored not only by his province in 2011 with the Order of Ontario, the most prestigious official honor in the province, but also by the Law Society with the Law Society Medal. Chris is a modest man with at least a couple pages of awards and memberships of various legal associations. He's found time to author Laskin's Contribution to Labor Law, and his name is found in various lists of who's who. Chris Paliare is a citizen of Canada, where human rights are important. In addition, he has roots as a Macedonian. He's much, much more. And when he decided to take up the case of Macedonian rights internationally, as well as here in Toronto, it was his status in the legal community that made our cause more credible. As an experienced trial lawyer, he defended the rights of Macedonians wherever necessary when it was not in the mainstream. He is a valuable longtime member of the Canadian Macedonian Place Foundation Board, and I am sure other boards at various times. For the Macedonian community, he is Chris Paliare, a Macedonian whose commitment and passion is unquestionable. When it came time to stand up for Macedonia, he was there when it counted at the beginning. I'm not suggesting that his voice alone was heard. However, we will hear his version of the various incidents and occasions when he participated in Toronto, North York, when he was in Moscow, Helsinki, Skopje, and Warsaw. The man was fearless, and I'm sure you will enjoy what he has to say. In an interview, the acclaimed historian, Margaret Macmillan, said, "We need to know history and respect it. I think it's part of being a citizen. This may fill in some of our history we need to know." And now, Chris Paliare.
Well, Virginia, thank you for that very generous introduction. I wish my late mother was still alive. She would applaud it and not recognize her son in all of those very nice comments. Let me thank the Canadian Macedonian Historical Society for this opportunity. And for those that are listening and who are not members, I encourage you to take up membership. It's not very much money, but it is critically important to the association, and that the preservation of our culture is critically important and very different today than it was when I was a young person growing up in Toronto, when we all lived within close proximity to one another. So I encourage you to do that. With respect to what I'd like to say tonight, I've divided my discussion into two parts. What was I able to do domestically, and what was I able to do internationally? Now, let me give you a caveat before I begin. I'm a lawyer, I'm not a historian. And so I am going to tell you what my journey was as I recall it literally 50 years ago. I go back to 1991 with respect to some of these events. And so if you want a more historical and precise understanding of what went on, consult people like Dr. Danforth or Dr. Andrew Rosas, who have studied historically what went on with respect to our people and the division of Macedonia over the years. So let me start domestically. And one of the events that is so clear in my mind is the events concerning the statue of Alexander the Great at Logan and Danforth in the city. And I got a call at my office from a Macedonian fellow named Danny. I think Danny has passed away, and he was a wonderful guy. And he called me, I didn't know him, and said, we wanted to lay a wreath at the statue of Alexander on his birthday, which my recollection was it was at some point in July, the third week in July, something like that. And we were prohibited from doing that, and now they won't give us a permit. So the story was a bit jumbled. So I said, come to the office and let's talk about it. So what occurred was they had a permit. This association, I don't know whether it was I'm not sure which association, but they had a permit that would allow them to march from Withrow Park, which would be about 3 blocks south of the Danforth, up to the statue and lay a wreath. So I asked him what happened. He said they started the parade and they were walking up Logan to Danforth. And when they got to Danforth, there was a whole group of Greeks who were surrounding the statue and weren't going to allow them to make that foray and to lay the wreath. And there were some police officers around, and calls were made, and more police officers came, and they ultimately persuaded Danny and his group that it was just too dangerous, and they weren't prepared for this kind of a confrontation. And so let's postpone it. And there was no one there to take on the police, saying they had a permit. So they dispersed. Then Danny told me that they couldn't get another permit. And I said, why not? They said, they won't give it to us. So I took up that cause, basically to say, we live in a free and democratic society, which has a charter of rights and freedoms that enshrines the ability to be engaged in freedom of speech, freedom of association, and all the other freedoms. And so I began to say to the city, give us a permit, and if you don't, I'm going to court to enjoin you to provide us with one. So that led to a meeting with, several meetings actually, with the mayor at the time, Art Eggleton. And so he called us in first to find out what we were wanting to do. So I'll explain what we wanted to do. And what I find amusing is what his response was. He said, well, no, but Alexander the Great statue is in the heart of Greek town. Well, you can't have a group of Macedonians going there to lay the wreath. I said, well, listen, freedom of rights, blah, blah, did all that. And he said, well, how about if we had a statue of Alexander and we put it up in Hyde Park? And I laughed. I said, you can't be serious. We want to lay a wreath at that statue. We have the absolute right to do it. It's a public park. Well, what about the danger? I said, it's the obligation of the police to protect our right to be able to do it. So that went back and forth a bit. And then he decided the way to deal with this matter was to have both the Greek group and our group attend at his office. So 8 o'clock one morning, I go there with Danny and a couple of other people, and there's a delegation of Greeks. And Eggleton begins the meeting by saying, well, it's a historic occasion. I'm so glad you're here. We have the Macedonians on one side and we have the Greeks on the other side, and we're able to have a dialogue. And the Greeks say, well, no, we're Macedonians. It was the first time I'd ever heard Greeks describe themselves as Macedonians. Obviously not ethnic Macedonians, although I think all of them were, but they were asserting that they came from that portion of Macedonia currently occupied by Greece and now called Macedonia. So I began questioning that and basically said, wait a minute, no, I'm Macedonian. No, I'm Macedonian. So we get into this whole debate. Any event, Eggleton doesn't know what to do with any of that, but he calms us all down and starts a dialogue about how can we accommodate our people to be able to lay this wreath. And also present, I forgot to tell you, was the superintendent of police for that region. And he was making it clear that this is not something he wanted in his district. So I was insistent, and I said, we're going to do it, and we're going to do it on this particular Sunday in July. And we got the permit, and Danny and his troops went to Withrow Park, and up they came to the Danforth. And it was to be at 4 o'clock to lay the wreath. I got there at about 3 at Logan and Danforth. And it was like a Hollywood movie. First of all, hundreds of Greeks at that corner. But in addition, there were policemen on horses. There were surrounding the statue, police in battle fatigue with shields protecting the statue. There were police officers on the roof. There was just north of that little park, a police trailer, not a paddy wagon, but a control center kind of panel, trailer. And the superintendent was there, and he greeted me and he said, you know what, we've got to call this off. This is 3 o'clock, we're to lay the wreath at 4. And I said, why? He said, well, we had a call saying that if you proceed with this, somebody's going to be taken out. It's the phrase he used. And I said, well, what are you talking about? He said, well, no, it's too dangerous. I said, you know what? These people are bullies. We are not going to be bullied out of doing this. So he wasn't able to persuade me to call it off. And so we then continued coming up with Withrow Park. These guys came up. And in the meantime, Art Eggleton showed up in his shorts and a summer shirt. And I said, Art, how are you? What are you doing here? He said, well, I was at a barbecue, but the superintendent called me because I may need to read the Riot Act. The Riot Act says that when the mayor reads the Riot Act, you are obliged to disperse within a half an hour. And if you don't, it's a criminal offense and you can be arrested. It hadn't been read in Toronto since 1929, I learned. And so I said, you're not going to read the Riot Act. We're just going to come and lay a wreath. It's going to be a peaceful demonstration. Your police officers will let us do this. Any event, the answer to that was no. And Art Eggleton eventually got on the podium and read the Riot Act. So we didn't get to lay the wreath. So that got a whole lot of publicity. We managed to keep our name in the newspaper about our rights and how they were being violated. So that's Alexander the Great. The next area in which we were involved, that would have been about 1991, I believe. And it was before the Republic got its independence. So the next events are after the Republic gets its independence. And we then, as an entity, as a group, as a community, want to raise our flag, the Macedonian flag, the then Macedonian flag, at city halls, got to remember, this was before amalgamation, at various communities in Toronto, and on our Independence Day, because everybody does it. The Chinese do it, the Asian communities do it, everybody does it. They just raise their flag on the Day of Independence, except for us. The one exception was North York, where Mel Lastman thought this was all crazy, and he really liked us and liked John Bidoff in particular, John Bidoff Sr., and permitted us to do it. There was then some problems when we did raise the flag with the Greek community hurling rocks and stones and whatnot. Any event, what happened with respect to Toronto was there was a refusal by Eagleton, and the answer was that they took the position that because Canada had not recognized the Republic of Macedonia as an independent country, therefore they weren't obliged to let us do this. So, notwithstanding all of that, we made an application to Scarborough to be able to raise the flag there. Now, that was a fascinating event because you get on the list of things that the council is going to talk about at the council meeting. And we were on the list, and we were number 3 on the list of, I don't know, 20 or 25 items. And so they dealt with number 1, and then they dealt with number 2, and they dealt with number 4, and they dealt with number 5, and they dealt with number 6, and the day's going on. And I speak to the clerk at one of the breaks saying, well, we were number 3, what happened to us? Oh, well, the mayor has asked to hold that down. Okay. And the day is going on and on and on, and we get to 5 o'clock and we haven't been heard. And they say, you know, that's the end of the day, and we'll be back tomorrow. So thinking, I guess, that we may not be back tomorrow, but they won't even tell us what time we'll be on. So on that day, I had a roll of quarters in my pocket because there weren't cell phones. I had to keep my law practice alive. And so I was at the payphone all day long, pumping quarters in and dealing with cases and people and my practice. Any event, next morning, we're back out there, and it's Mary Dimitriou and another lovely woman named Julie Blazowski, who I think was a law student at the time. She's a lawyer now, I believe. And they're both citizens of Scarborough. And so that was the entree, but I was going to lead off speaking. So we eventually get called, and there is a lot of animosity towards us, because I learned that the mayor had been invited to and gone to the Florina Festival in Leading, paid for by the Pan-Macedonian Greek entities on several occasions. And so he was empathetic to the Greek position, namely that there was no such thing as a Macedonian. So I get up and I'm doing my thing. And so I'm on one side of the room with Mary and Julie. On the other side of the room, there's 5 Greek men. And so eventually one of the counselors, when I'm fielding these questions, says, well, Mr. Paliare, you keep talking about these Macedonians. Like, what's the difference between a Macedonian and a Greek? Oh man, it was fabulous. I said, thank you so much for asking that question. And so I go right into it. I go into culture, I go into history, I go into language, I go into the naming of our kids. I do the whole thing. And then at the end of it, I don't know where I got the nerve to do this. And I say, the other difference between us is, as you will see, we allow the women in our community to speak publicly. Oh, well, I mean, they went nuts. And I said, I apologize. I shouldn't have made that comment, but it was true. There were no women lined up on the Greek side. Any event, we got turned down, needless to say, at Scarborough, but we did have success in Hamilton. There was a wonderful community out in Hamilton, and I went to the council meeting in Hamilton, And we got permission to do it. And I remember on a day going out with my wife, Eva, and my two daughters, and we marched around with the Macedonian community there. So that's flag raising. The next area domestically, student associations at the universities. So York University, Macedonian students want to have the Macedonian Student Association. The Hellenic Society says, no, that's not permitted. We're Macedonians and they can't have that name. So we then go up and meet with the folks up there, and there's a whole debate about all of that. And I was more successful there. We got that association established. And it was the same thing, and I won't repeat it, at Ryerson. There was a whole thing about the inability of us to have a Macedonian association there, and we ultimately prevailed. And so I went and fought that battle for them as well. Additionally, domestically, we would march to the legislature on Greek Independence Day. And we didn't want to interfere with the parade on the Danforth, because I do believe in freedom of association and they have a right to have their parade, but similarly, we have a right to dissent. And so we would meet at the legislature. We got permission from the legislature to do that. And John Bidoff would arrange all of that. And there'd be a microphone, and we would walk up University Avenue to the legislature, and a number of us would speak. And I must say I enjoyed doing those because it was an opportunity to rail away about how it's fine for the Greeks to celebrate their Independence Day, but there are 1 million residents of Greece who are not independent. And we are their voice. They have no voice. They are not able to speak their own language. They are not able to dissent. And at the time, the president of Greece was Mr. Papandreou, who had taught at York University and therefore knew all about the freedoms that we enjoy in Canada. And he would have, this was part of my speech, he would have marked report cards for students in his classes. And so I would go through the report card on Papandreou. Let's talk about freedom of speech, F, freedom of association, F. So I gave him an F on all of his report card. In any event, those were the events of the early 90s in Toronto. Internationally, those were, for me, very exciting. Again, I was encouraged to do this by John Bidoff. I had a young family. I had a busy practice. But he said, I need you to go to Moscow for a human rights conference. And so I became part of the Canadian Macedonian Human Rights Organization, which got status as a non-governmental organization at this conference in Moscow. And let me just be clear, that Canadian Human Rights Organization is not the Canadian Macedonian Human Rights Organization that's currently in existence, of which I am not a member. So they are totally different people, different philosophy. And so I need to paint a bit of a picture for you, if you give me a moment to understand what this conference was about, why it was important, and how it worked. And I learned all of this on the fly, I must say. I showed up with Mary and Trian Dimitriou from Canada. They're such wonderful, committed warriors for Macedonian human rights. It was such a pleasure to assist them. But as well, we had a group of Australian Macedonian human rights activists. A guy named Dr. Chris Paliare. He's written, these guys have written all kinds of books about it. He's not a medical doctor, he's a PhD doctor. Michael Radin, brilliant lawyer, written again extensively on these topics, and they spoke perfect Macedonian, which of course I didn't. I speak a bit of Selsko, but not the kind of Macedonian they speak, which was fabulous to have. And there was about 3 or 4 others whose names I don't recall at the moment. And so the 7 or 8 of us were there, and we were joined by delegations from Agetski, Macedonia, Risto Sideropoulos, and a couple of others. I'll get to him in a moment. Representatives from Pirinska, Macedonia. That is the Bulgarian part of Macedonia. And surprisingly for all of us, there were people from the Albanian portion of Macedonia. A wonderful medical doctor from Tirana, who was there with 2 or 3 others, and they have preserved the Macedonian language and the Macedonian culture with a lot of difficulty, particularly in the Hoxha regime for Albania. So that was the group. Why were we there? We were there as under the auspices of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE. And the OSCE was an organization of 35 nations, all of the European nations, save and except Albania, were signed onto this along with Canada and the United States. And as part of the OSCE's auspices was an organization called the Human Dimension. And the Human Dimension would meet every other year to talk about violations of human rights in the member states. So let me just take a minute to outline for you what this organization does and what we were doing. So the this comes from the Law Library of Congress of the United States, and the heading is Greece, and it talks about status of minorities. And let me just say as an aside, we aren't alone in Greece as a minority that is adversely affected with respect to human rights. So are the Turks. That's because, just fast forward for a minute, the position of the Greek government is this: we are a truly homogenous society. Yes, we have signed all of these treaties, the UN Declaration of Human Rights, the Helsinki Accord that guarantees rights to minorities. We've signed all of those. And if we had any minorities, we would extend them those rights. But we don't have any minorities. A completely absurd position, and recognized so by the other communities. So let me tell you what this is all about. It says, at the international and regional levels, a panoply of norms, standards, and principles have been developed by the United Nations, the Council of Europe, the European Union, of which Greece was one of the 9 members initially, and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. What's for? To protect and safeguard minority rights. Such norms, standards, and principles are binding on Greece legally due to ratification and or politically, as is the case of the OSCE commitments. In particular, under Article 27 of this international covenant, as interpreted by the Human Rights Committee, the body of experts that monitors the implementation of the covenant, Greece may be obliged to take positive measures to ensure that minorities enjoy their fundamental human rights, including their culture, language, and religion. and are protected against acts of Greek authorities, be they judicial, administrative, or legislative, and also against acts of other persons. In other words, positive obligations imposed by treaties signed by the Greek government. Now, what's meant by a minority? What does that mean? Well, Law Library of Congress spells that out. A number of international instruments and case law on minorities says this: it's the existence of minorities is not based on law, but a matter of fact. In other words, factually, are these people a minority? Next, that's number one. Number two, in addition to the human rights applicable to all individuals, minorities have the right to enjoy their own culture. In other words, you've got the individual rights, but you also have the collective rights. And they have, what rights are those? To practice their own religion and use their own language in community with others of their group. And finally, the right of self-identification. A group may be defined as a minority if it meets certain objective criteria, such as ethnicity, language, or religion, and numerical inferiority, that is, they are in a minority position, as well as the subjective element of self-identification. That is, you say, this is who I am. In recognizing minorities within their borders, states cannot arbitrarily deny their existence. So this organization is designed to be able, on a biannual basis, meets every 2 years, all 35 nations, and NGOs, non-governmental organizations, have the right to come and to talk about breaches of member states of minority rights. So how do you do that? 35 nations. There's Switzerland and Norway and Sweden and the Netherlands, and they're all of them, and Russia, and US and Canada. So the Australians and ourselves, we broke up into teams, and we would then spend the day trying to organize meetings with those various countries. Can we get a half hour? Can we get 45 minutes? And they all, almost all, accommodated us. And so I might go, for example, with the doctor from Albania and Risto Sideropoulos. And when I say I was fortunately able to bring my wife along, Eva Marszewski. Many of you know her. She is also a committed social justice person and committed to human rights issues, and also happens to be a lawyer. And so she was, again, enormously effective in running around trying to get these meetings. And part of the problem was, this was September of 1991. You may recall, those of you who are old enough, about Yeltsin being on the tanks in Moscow in September of 91. We were there about 2 weeks after that, so there was a whole lot of that stuff going on. But this is before the Republic got its independence. And so when you show up at one of these meetings, these are very high-level foreign affairs people, but who are Macedonians? What is Macedonia? It was merely one of the 6 republics of Yugoslavia, and nobody knew anything about it. So you got to explain who you are, and then you got to talk about the violations of the human rights. The easiest one, of course, was Sideropoulos. So you say his name is Risto Sideropoulos, not because of choice, but because he is not permitted to have a Slavic Macedonian name. You cannot name your child in Greece with the name Boris or any other Slavic name. It is not permitted because the Greek Orthodox Church and the government work hand in glove. So we would go through all that. And Sideropoulos, what was his crime? His crime was he wanted to open a cultural association, a Macedonian cultural association in Leding, Florina, now called. And that was not permitted. Why is it not permitted? Because you cannot in Greece have any ethnic name attached to any public office without the permission of the government. No permission granted. He was sentenced to, I don't know, 6-8 months in jail off an island, I think in Kefalonia, for that crime, in addition to him coming to these human rights conferences. So think about the double down on this. He has a right to go to these human rights conferences on what I just read you. But when he gets back, because he was putting forward that there was such a thing as a Macedonian minority, he was prosecuted for that too, because that was contrary to the public interest of the Greek government. It's an embarrassment. We don't have these people. There's no such thing as a Macedonian. So Sideropoulos' case was fabulous for being able to demonstrate the violations by Greece to their fellow members, particularly those of the European Union, of which, as I say, Greece was one of 9 members. So we shone some light on our cause in Moscow. That was 91. I'm going to skip forward to 93. I went to Helsinki with Mary Dimitriou, and I think Sideropoulos was there as well. But that's the first time I met Pope Tsarknias. If none of you have met him, I hope you do one day. He's an extraordinary human being. He was, in 2 sentences, he was a Greek Orthodox priest who was ethnically Macedonian. And during these difficult times, he said to his bishop, we're not treating these Macedonians fairly. And the bishop said, you know what, I think you're right. But what we need you to do is to be transferred to some parish up in the hills. And that's where he went. They wanted to isolate him, and then they excommunicated him. And then he went to the Republic of Macedonia and got ordained as a Macedonian Orthodox priest, which he is now. So he went back to Greece to try to start a Macedonian Orthodox church. Not permitted, not permitted. And he was prosecuted about 10 times. And he had fines of about $15,000 and time in jail totaling over a year. What was his crime? Personating, that is impersonating, a Greek Orthodox priest, because he looked like a Greek Orthodox priest. He had the black robes, he had the big high hat, and Nicodeme Tsarknias would be about 6'2" with his big hat and stuff. And he's about 6'5". He's an imposing person, salt and pepper beard, very religious, wonderful human being. And did he tell anybody he was a Greek Orthodox priest? No. Did anybody think he was a Greek Orthodox priest? No. But he was alleged to be impersonating a Greek Orthodox priest. So I'll get to that because we deal with that when we get to Warsaw. So when we get to Helsinki, we have some of the Greek, the Macedonians from the Greek part, and we have Tsarknias, and we're able to talk about freedom of religion and all of these other basic freedoms that have been violated. By this time, we have built up some capital because we meet with some of the same people that we met with 2 years before. Particularly, the one that sticks in my mind was the US ambassador. This is a very high level stuff. In fact, there were a number of people who were ambassadors to the OSCE, and the US had one. And he was wonderful, and he got it. And by the time we showed up the second time and there had been no improvements, he was troubled by it. So we did it again with Mary and I dividing up the whole thing. And she's fabulous. You got to have energy. These were not vacations, I can tell you. These were days that we worked tirelessly. Now we go to Warsaw in 1996. And my fabulous wife, Eva, happens to also, among other things, speak Polish. That was her language when she was growing up. She's not from Poland, but she speaks perfect Polish. So all these conferences are held in English, but all the staff who spoke English for the conference were also Polish. And so we had some benefit to Eva's intervention because they did things for us that were very helpful. And on this occasion, this particular conference the whole concept was about freedom of religion only. So we weren't into Sideropoulos, we weren't into the other violations. This was only about religion. And I had Exhibit A with me. Exhibit A was Tsarknius, this holy man who, you couldn't ask for a better example of religion. There he is. And so we do the whole thing about talking to different nations and stuff. And I persuade the people running the conference that I want to have a discussion about the situation in Greece in front of a plenary session. There was a plenary session, but getting on the list was very difficult because there were by then about 45 nations, and we were in the Warsaw Pact buildings. And there's this enormous table with all of these 45 or 50 nations all sitting around it. And they're talking about freedom of religion. And so they tell me I've got 6 minutes to make my pitch. I think I only took about 18 because nobody was going to interrupt me because I had Tsarknius sitting right beside me. And you could hear a pin drop when I began talking about his plight, trying to start a church in Greece that was not permitted. And then he's prosecuted. And these fines are piling up, his time in jail is piling up. And the one thing I haven't mentioned is, in addition to Eva, we had an extraordinary Torontonian Macedonian with us, Peter Madiskus. And he was absolutely fabulous. And the beauty of it was Peter also spoke perfect Macedonian, so he was able to communicate with Reverend Tsarknius, which I was unable to do with my Selsko Macedonian. And we made huge strides there, so much so that there was a representative from the United States, from Jimmy Carter's center in Atlanta, who I made friends with because we both went to the gym at 6 a.m. I didn't know who he was, and turns out he was there on behalf of the Jimmy Carter Center. And he then learned of what we were talking about, and we got a letter from him sent to President Mitsotakis about this case, and we got other people to write. And because what was coming up was, this was in April, Tsarknius's appeal was to be heard in June. By then, as I say, he's got $10,000 worth of fines. He's got time in jail. In addition to that, those letters, I was able to persuade a barrister from England to go and monitor the appeal of Tsarknius pro bono. We would, I don't know where the we was, we found money. We would pay his expenses, but he would monitor the trial. And I can remember the appeal. I can remember this was in June of that year. He called me quite excited to tell me that the appeal had been allowed and all the charges had been dismissed. And he said, I think my presence was helpful. I said, well, how would they know who you were? You were just monitoring. You said, well, I was the only blonde person in the room. So it was, anyway, so they knew they were being watched. So those were some of the things that we were doing. And I was honored and excited to be able to help. And I can tell you that the address in the War Pact room on behalf of Reverend Sarknius was one of the true highlights of my career. It was passionate, it was moving. I was, I probably can't say this, I guess, on this, but I was really pissed off. I was just so angry at his treatment. It was just unjustifiable. Oh, and so I tell them in this War Pact room, I say, and so I tell them the whole thing about the Macedonians and how we're mistreated by Greece. And this is one example. And you know, you're going to hear from the Greeks. They're going to talk about these so-called Macedonians. Well, I can tell you, all of my grandparents were born and raised in that portion of Macedonia, currently occupied by Greece. And we are Macedonians. There are at least 1 million people who are ethnic Macedonians living there, and they're going to denounce that and say it doesn't exist. They now call on the Greek guy to respond, and he begins by saying, "These so-called Macedonians," you know, and on it went. And so I had foreshadowed what he would say because I'd listened to it before, and they say we don't exist. Any event, this has been fun, and thank you for inviting me.
Chris, I was delighted to hear you speak tonight. Thank you very much for a really lively talk and leading a really lively discussion tonight. And thank you for introducing yourself as a fellow Riverdalean alumni as well. So there's 3 of us from Riverdale Collegiate here tonight. I want to thank Chris as well for electing to kindly donate his honorarium back to our society. And before I turn it over to Ginny to wrap up, I just want to give a shout out to the volunteers of our board who spend countless person hours organizing events like this. I think we're unsung heroes, and thank you to all of you. And with that, I will turn it back over to Ginny.
Thank you. Thank you. You know, Chris, I've wanted to have this session for years and years because I knew that what you had to say was important, and you certainly haven't disappointed. We didn't need any pictures. You drew all the pictures with your words. Thank you again, Chris. I hope that it was good for you because it was good for us.
Thank you for the opportunity, and it's a story I've never told, and so it was fun to memorialize it in some way. It was a great journey, and so when you asked me to do it, I had to play it all back in my mind, and it was fun. I enjoyed doing it, and I hope it inspired some to perhaps pick up the spark and carry on. Hope so.
Who knows? You may have done that. You may have done that. There were some lawyers that listened to you tonight, and you don't know. Actually, you throw out all these things into the ocean, and somebody picks it up. So thanks again. I can't say it enough. Thank you.
Thank you.
It was
Pleasure.
wonderful.
Okay. Good night, everybody.